Engineers of Reddit. What's something that's designed into a machine solely because of the stupidity of human beings? Story 1. Newer operating systems are closed off to the general users because people would delete Windows or whatever and brick their computers. The System 32 virus is serious business. Story 2. Breakaway fuel pump hoses. I don't know why people drive off with them in the car. Story 3. A lot of go push buttons are just far enough away from whatever is going. Commercial finger pincher, industrial arm cutter offer, etc. So the operator can't reach the machine. Operators have solved the problem of not getting their fingers cut by using a stick to push the button. Story 4. If you have a freestanding range, it came with an anti-tip-over bracket that is supposed to be screwed to the floor and hold one of the range's rear feet to prevent it from tipping forward when a child climbs onto the open oven door. Almost no one installs these brackets because they're a PETA, but they're included with every range because in the event a child does get injured by tipping over the range, the liability goes to whoever didn't install the bracket, not the manufacturer. There's also the lid and door lock on closed washing machines. It's there solely to keep people from opening the machine while it's running, reaching inside, getting tangled in the clothes, and having their arms injured. So much of the engineering behind consumer products is about making things foolproof. The problem is that the fools keep getting more foolish. To quote my intro to engineering prof, the universe will take your attempts to make something foolproof as a personal insult and will, in turn, make a better fool. Story 5. It's not a machine, but the progress bars in TurboTax are a sham. Computers are fast and the calculations aren't that hard. Whenever it says calculating, that's just to make the humans feel like they got their money's worth. Story 6. Newer cars with a push-button start feature were initially designed so that if you needed to turn the engine off in an emergency, even if the car wasn't geared and moving, you could hold down the push button for several seconds. But people are dumb and panic. So instead of holding the button down, they would repeatedly stab at the button, like when they think hitting an elevator button or crosswalk button repeatedly will make it work faster. So car manufacturers had to set up the emergency power-off feature to respond to either a long hold of the button or the repeated panic tapping of the button. Story 7. Industrial presses often have two buttons more than an arm range apart from each other to start them pressing. Guess why? Story 8. The entire field of UI and UX design revolves around pleasing the stupid while not annoying the intelligent. A great designer once told me, never assume your users are stupid, but never forget that they are. Story 9. Not safety, but human impatience. Many airports make you walk a certain distance to the baggage claim so that you don't get there earlier than your luggage does. Story 10. Normally stupid warning labels. We can't stop you from hurting yourself like a moron, but we can stop you from suing us. I always love seeing the caution hot on something with an open flame. Someone out there had to be stupid enough to not figure that out on their own. Just a quick message, if you like our content and love listening to our stories, please press the subscribe button and click on the notification bell so you'll get updated for more of our uploads. Now back to the stories. Story 11. When I was in college, we had a cold roll mill. Basically 2 rollers designed to roll metal thin, incredibly powerful. During the training, it was explained the position of the emergency stop button was such that if you got your hand caught in it, your head would hit the E-stop before it pulled you in completely and rolled you down to about 1/8 of an inch thick. Sure, your arm would be 1/8 of an inch thick, but at least it's just that. Story 12. I used to work in a building where the air ducts and air diffusers were originally designed to be almost completely silent. Well, apparently when the building opened, a lot of tenants complained that the air wasn't working. Well, it was working fine, they couldn't hear it and assumed it wasn't running. The building ended up putting these sound boxes in the ceiling near every diffuser to simulate the sound of air blowing. Could have saved money by just tying some ribbons or something to the vents. Story 13. Putting barriers at railroad crossings that block the whole road, and not just the directional lane, because even with the lights flashing and barriers down, people still think they can drive around the gates and beat the train. I've been called to the scene for some pretty nasty cleanups because people didn't want to wait an extra 5 minutes for a train to pass. Story 14. Half of mechanical engineering design is trying to figure out how the end users are going to misuse a mechanism and either hurt themselves or break something. I seriously can't think of any mechanism that doesn't have some kind of anti-fool thought put into it. I had a professor in one of my classes say, if it can possibly be used as a hammer, someone somehow will use it as one. This is why so many things are so bulky and reinforced past what the normal accidental dropping or use factor of safety is. People will walk 5 minutes without complaint, but whine like 2-year-olds if they have to stand around for 5 minutes. Story 15. If you work in an office, chances are you have an IP desk phone, the ones that use a network cable. Now, if you pick it up, you will hear a dial tone or some other white noise. That's completely artificial. It's just an audio file the phone goes out of its way to play for you. Why? Normally the phones are silent, but the first company that popularized them, I think it was Cisco, kept getting complaints that the phones were broken because there was no dial tone. So they just slapped some white noise on the phones and people stopped complaining. Story 16. Sound symposers in small vehicles. We can't make that 4-cylinder sound like a V8 in its own, so we will just pipe very selective engine noises into the cabin to make it sound better. Or even better, do what BMW does and just play fake engine noises over your radio speakers. My company had some crazy ways of keeping people from hurting themselves. So my company has been around since 1914, and we have lots of stamping presses, hydraulic and automatic. In today's world, we use a light current that would stop the machine as soon as something would cross its field. Easy, modern, and keeps OSHA at bay. Back in the day, this technology wasn't available, so guess how we kept people out? We chained their arms. Yes, we had them in chains that would pull their arms back when the machine was completing its downstroke. We have an old picture of roughly 30 mechanical presses side by side with all of the machine operators chained to them. It just looked wrong. But yeah, thank goodness for technology. Story 17. If someone who makes Coke freestyle machines is reading this, you haven't worked hard enough. You'd be amazed at how many people cannot figure out how to get soda out of this giant glorified printer. Story 18. I'm a mechanical engineer. My boss has literally told me, don't make things so someone won't hurt themselves or do it wrong, make it so they physically can't. So add a lot of poke yoke items to jigs and fixtures, also light, curtains, safety interlocks, door switches, machine guarding, etc. It does keep people safe, but when a machine is down and you have to work on it, it can be a real pain to actually make it move again when you need it to. Story 19. Tutorials in video games. You might think it's stupid and obtuse, but you'd be surprised how many of our testers can't figure out a concept, like the blue key goes into the blue door or that a sword can be used as a weapon. You haven't learned humility until you've stood there in silence for half an hour, watching someone completely fail to figure out how to proceed through a level or game or whatever you created. Story 20. Power paper cutters require that the human operator simultaneously push two buttons. This is to prevent the accidental injury of the operator's hand. Story 21. The reason an ATM gives your card back before your cash is because you just grab the cash and forget your card. I was in a foreign country where the ATM gave your cash before your card and walked away without my debit card. But apparently, if you leave your card in the machine, it will get sucked in and stored internally. Thankfully, I was able to get it back when the bank opened the next day. But yeah, people like me are the reason for that. Story 22. The Castell key system makes it literally impossible to have the door of many ribbon blenders open while the machine is running. We have two at work, one that does around 25 kilograms and one that does up to 1,000 kilograms. You have to close the lid and bolt it shut, which releases one key, which goes into a keyhole. Every key has a raised code on it, so only this one key works in this lock, which releases a second key. This second key goes into a box and is turned, which activates the power button. Only then can you activate it. Story 23. Mechanical engineer here. Worst invention ever are these freaking safety nozzles they put on new gas cans. You have to push this switch while pressing this lever while pushing down on the nozzle, and half the time nothing comes out. These things never work properly and are a pain to use. I long for the good old days of just tipping the container and having gas come out. It's supposed to assist you in tipping the can over into the fuel tank without pouring gas all over the ground. Unfortunately, the design is overly complicated and you usually end up pouring gas all over the ground. Story 24. I had a friend in trade school that once touched a piece of metal he just welded to see if it was hot. Story 25. Working in the passenger rail industry has made me more of a misanthrope than I already was. My standard design guide for anything accessible to passengers and drivers, yes, they're just as bad. If they can steal it, they'll break it. If they can break it, they'll hurt themselves with it. Those little hammers for breaking the emergency glass are held there with a wire, so you can't steal them. The wire is that short so you can't use it as a weapon. That ride on the train you're getting is likely 80% subsidized by taxes. That means you're literally paying less than a quarter what it actually costs to move your around. That tempered glass windscreen you just scratched your initials into is now a safety hazard and will cost a couple of $1,000s to replace. Stuffing paper into the floor heater grate creates a fire hazard. Show some respect and please refrain from vandalizing and damaging stuff mostly paid for by people who don't ride the train, just because you're bored or pissed off at the world. Story 26. Not an engineer, but a millwright who works around industrial equipment daily. Most e-stops and large machines won't save you. They're so large, and asking them to stop on a dime ain't gonna happen. The dumbest guard I've ever had to make is on a roll stamp machine. It's more or less a hydraulic press. You put the part in, line it up, and have to hit two buttons a few feet apart, and that's a safety on its own. We had a guy who would kinda toss one of the parts in the holder and hope it was in the right spot when he hit the button. If it wasn't, the machine wouldn't work. I could save time and bump the part with my nose rather than use my hands. He did, apparently for a year or so. One day, he hits the buttons with his nose in the part, the press comes down and gets the tip of his nose. He freaks out and lets go of the buttons, and that stopped the machine with him stuck in it. One of the joys of maintenance is you gotta be the guy to get the other guy out of the machine, and because of that, a ton of first responder training is necessary for the job. I gave him the once-over, made sure he didn't get his head or neck pulled in, and cut up an oxygen mask and more or less taped it to his mouth so he could get air while someone called the fire department. The department shows up and asks if I can get him out because I know my way around the machines, and I go get my toolbox. Unfortunately, the bolts I needed access to were blocked by his body, and the jaws of life won't touch hardened steel, so our options were limited. The press is on a ratchet system, so it doesn't throw a part of hydraulic line blows, and luckily for the guy stuck, the ratchet was just on a new tooth, meaning it had to go down further to be released. I informed the fire department it will have to move another 1/4 inch down so the press head would go back up. We finally said, whatever, he ain't gonna die, so we'll just run it down and get it over with. The paramedics load him up with Dilaudid, and we try to go down, only to find that the guy who was stuck kicked the wiring for the hydraulic valve and broke it. They had to splice some wiring right at his waist level, and he's an incredibly obese Iowan, so the smells were interesting. They fixed the wiring and dropped the press down. It releases, and he pops up looking like Rudolph the obese Iowan. Once he came back to work, I made him repeat what he did in a locked-out machine so I could make guard for it, and was impressed by his stupidity. I painted it in his favorite color. He still works there and is as dumb as a pancake, but he has a heart. Nice guy, just eats paint chips. Story 27. Contains peanuts warning on a package of peanuts. Story 28. All red at an intersection. This is to create a buffer for reaction times of running the red light and people eager to leave right at a green light. Story 29. A lot of things in software and operating systems only exist to stop impatient people from overloading the computer with excessive demands. Spinning wheels, hourglasses, progress bars, none of these are required, nor are they likely to accurately represent the progress of the task at hand. They're simply there to reassure us that the computer is doing something so we don't keep asking it to do the same thing 5 times and crash it. Story 30. New CNC machines have locks on the doors and require the doors to be locked during operation. The downside about that is that maintenance mode doesn't override this feature. So when you have a job that has, say, 18 different tools and you have to load them, they make you close the door after you load each tool. The only thing you can do with the doors open in maintenance mode is jog the axis so you can zero the thing. Story 31. Automotive mechanic, not engineer. Car wiring harnesses all have plugs that only plug one way because of their shape, and although they're color-coded, the shape and the wires also only allow specific plugs to be plugged into each other so that mechanics don't accidentally plug in the wrong thing, as foolproof as you can get. Story 32. Having to put the brakes on before being able to shift from park to drive. Story 33. At a previous job, we used to engineer things to be sailor-proof, as we called it. I worked at a shipyard, and it was amazing to hear some of the stories of what went down on board a Navy ship. That's not to say sailors are dumb, but there were some bad eggs in the bunch that would occasionally damage things with intent. And as a general rule, military folk aren't easy in equipment. Story 34. I'm a structural engineer, so I mostly design buildings and not machines, but most of the things that I design require someone to build. I take human error into account for almost everything. If something's too complex to build, they're just going to take the path of least resistance and probably mess it up. That fastener spacing needs to be 4 3/4 inch maximum. Let's bump it up 4 inches. That concrete beam only needs to be 10 inches wide by 21 inches deep. Just bump it up to 1 foot wide by 2 feet deep. This also means that you may use the same connection everywhere because using 2 or 3 connections could get messed up, depending on the quantity and complexity of connections, of course. This also applies to members, foundations, and just about everything else in between. That's just scratching the surface, and of course, it's on a case-by-case basis. Story 35. There's actually an entire scientific methodology around designing things, so people can't mess them up. It's called poka-yoke. It's the reason diesel pumps are larger so they don't fit into standard gas tanks, or why electrical outlets are either symmetric, so they can plug in either way, or only fit one direction, like a 3-prong style. Story 36. Not a machine, but basically, all cleaning products produce foam when used. Also, basically, all cleaning products do not need to produce foam to work, but are made to do so solely so people like them. Old-timey versions of soap did tend to produce a lot of foam. Newer formulations were actually better at cleaning but didn't produce foam. People complained that the soap didn't work and couldn't even produce a good head of foam, despite the fact that said foam has no bearing whatsoever on the cleaning effects. So the manufacturers added a chemical solely to produce foam, and the consumers suddenly loved the new, improved soap. To this day, nearly all cleaning products, including toothpaste, still have chemicals added to them to produce purely decorative foam. Story 37. I bought a bag of shrimp, and on the package it said, "May contain shrimp." I'm not upset that it had that label. I'm upset that it said it may contain. I'd hope it contains it. Story 38. This is literally my life. I and my team design high-volume assembly lines. We have the easy stuff like redundant e-stops, pull cord kill switches, light curtains, kill machine motion when tripped. Profile gates won't allow anything but the part to pass through without force, and bright red flashing lights to let an operator know that automatic movement is happening. But we also get even deeper. Sensors and signals to let any operator know a hoist is attached properly, which will lift if the sensor isn't tripped. This is redundancy to verify it's clamped correctly, usually over or under travel sensors. We have force limiters at pinch points to make sure an operator doesn't get hurt if their finger is in the wrong place. Tool sensors to make sure something attached isn't dragged down the assembly line or flung back at an operator. It's a glorious system of checks and counterchecks held together by control engineers that don't have enough time to sit down all day. Safety in a truly modern plant is astounding. just analyzing how people can hurt themselves during normal operation, or maintenance procedures before a machine is even built, and even more systems in place when we enter the unknown. Story 39. You can't make something foolproof, because God is a better designer than you are and He designs the fools. If you do make a foolproof system, don't forget that next year they'll release a new and improved model of fools. Story 40. Automated machines in pretty much every factory have redundant kill switches in the form of pressure-sensitive mats, light walls, essentially the mechanism that makes your garage door reverse and raise when you break the beam, etc., all because people have and will mindlessly walk into a moving robot or machine and injure themselves. Story 41. Most of the time when a TV starts to wear out, overheat, or lose intensity, it's because someone turned the brightness up to max one time when there was a glare irritating them and never switched it back, so they try to restrict the settings in order to have their products last longer. That whole thing when you get a new TV and it looks so much brighter, more vibrant, all that good stuff, it actually is. But your old one was probably just as nice when it first started out. Get curtains instead of turning up your TV's brightness, and it'll last a lot longer. Story 42. The repeat your password or email here field in every form is to save users from their own typos. I understand needing a second password, but the second email is just annoying. I once came across a website that required a double input for the email, but only one for the password. Story 43. I worked at an amusement park and we got a ride from Europe. In Europe, they had leaner bars located 4 feet from the spinning deck of the ride. Over there, you're apparently smart enough to not step into a spinning machine of doom. We had to add interlocked gates 20 feet back that would automatically stop the ride if someone breached the perimeter. We might need a better educational system here. Story 44. As a software engineer, almost everything. If a user could consistently use something the way it was supposed to, then all the code I have ever written could be 50% smaller. But you have to account for every little thing that someone could possibly do wrong to ensure a good UX. Story 45. Not so much a machine, but the little needles that diabetics use to test their blood sugar have retractable needles. Not for the safety of disposal, but because people were reusing old needles and sharing. This makes them single-use and forces the user to dispose of the used needle as it's rendered useless. Story 46. My old engineering tutor used to tell us about how architecturally you could evaluate exactly where you would need to add metal poles into pillars to reinforce them. Normally, only 2 or so would be needed in 2 of the corners of the pillar. However, because the entire stability of the building was compromised if the poles were in the wrong corners, if the builders rotated the blueprints or something, so instead they added poles to all 4 corners, just to cover the bases. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to check out this next video. The YouTube algorithm really thinks you like it.